Picture two apologies, almost the same words. I'm sorry. But something about how each one lands is completely different. One comes fast, wraps up quickly, and moves straight into asking why this still keeps coming up. The other one is slower, sits in the discomfort a little longer, and doesn't flinch when the same question comes back around a second time or a third. Same two words, two entirely different things happening underneath them. Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. This is episode 5 in our series on betrayal trauma, and today we're shifting the lens slightly. The last few episodes looked at what happens inside the person who was betrayed. Today we're looking at the other side of the room, at what's actually happening inside a person after they've been caught, and why two people can say sorry using the exact same words while meaning almost opposite things. Here's the question underneath this whole episode. Are they sorry, or are they just sorry they got caught? Researchers have spent a fair amount of time trying to pull those two things apart because on the surface they can look identical. Someone might cry, someone might apologize repeatedly, someone might even seem in the moment completely devastated. And none of that on its own tells you which one you're actually looking at. Let's start with the basic emotional vocabulary because the words guilt, regret, shame, and remorse get used almost interchangeably in everyday conversation, and that's part of the problem. Researchers who've actually studied this closely found something interesting. All four of these emotions share one thing in common, a basic sense of wishing things had gone differently. But that's roughly where the similarity ends, and the differences matter enormously for anyone trying to figure out what's actually happening across the table from them. Here's the distinction that does the most work. Guilt is fundamentally about the other person. It's the discomfort of having caused harm to someone specific. And it tends to come packaged with something researchers consistently find alongside it: empathy for what that harm actually felt like from the other side. Regret works differently. Regret is fundamentally about the self. It's the discomfort of not having lived up to your own ideal picture of who you are. Notice what that means. You can feel intense regret, genuinely, without ever really landing on what the other person went through, because regret's whole center of gravity sits inside your own self-image, not inside their experience. This is why researchers describe remorse as sitting much closer to guilt than to regret. Real remorse carries that same outward-facing quality guilt has, an actual awareness of the other person's suffering, not just discomfort about your own damaged sense of self. And this distinction isn't just theoretical, it shows up in what people actually do next. Guilt reliably drives people toward repair, toward apology, toward accountability. Regret doesn't carry that same pull at all. Researchers studying something they call prudential regret, meaning regret over consequences to yourself specifically, found it can genuinely reduce someone's future bad behavior. People who feel it are less likely to repeat the offense. But here's the catch. Prudential regret doesn't require taking responsibility, and it doesn't require empathy for who got hurt. Someone can stop the affair, stay in the marriage, and never once fully reckon with what it did to their spouse, purely because they're afraid of what losing the marriage would cost them personally. Let's go through the specific angles worth watching for, because I think these translate the research into something you can actually observe. Start with defensiveness. Researchers point to a few concrete barriers that keep people from offering a genuine, complete apology, and I think naming them helps. Low concern for the person they hurt is one. A perceived threat to their own self-image is another, meaning admitting real wrongdoing feels like it would collapse how they see themselves. And a third barrier is simply believing the apology won't work anyway, so why bother making it a good one? Interestingly, researchers have found that people with a more avoidant attachment style tend to offer noticeably less complete, more defensive apologies, which fits a pattern a lot of betrayed spouses recognize immediately: the apology that somehow turns into a debate about tone, timing, or how the confrontation itself was handled. Now, here's a subtler one: impatience with questions. This deserves real attention because it's counterintuitive. You'd think more apologies would build more trust over time. Researchers studying this found something closer to the opposite. Repeated apologies, offered again and again without real change underneath them, actually erode trust rather than rebuilding it. What mattered far more than how often someone said sorry was whether the apology was emotionally accurate, meaning it correctly named what the betrayed partner was actually feeling. An apology that gets the emotional reality right builds significantly more trust than one that's just frequent. And an apology that gets it wrong, that names the wrong feeling entirely, can do worse than no apology at all because it reads as performance rather than understanding. So if someone seems worn out by the same question being asked again, worth noticing what that fatigue is actually about. Fatigue with repeating an apology isn't the same as fatigue with genuinely sitting inside what they did. Image management is closely related, and it shows up in a specific research finding I find genuinely useful. Physical displays of remorse, crying, kneeling, visible anguish do reliably increase how sincere someone appears to an outside observer, but across multiple large studies, those same displays had essentially no measurable effect on actual forgiveness. Let that sit for a second. The performance of remorse and the substance of remorse turned out to be almost completely unlinked in the data. There's a related finding worth naming too: that secondary emotions, deep anguish, dramatic distress, can actually backfire and produce less forgiveness than a plain apology would, specifically when the person receiving it starts to doubt whether the display is genuine. Impressive doesn't mean honest, and the research is fairly blunt about that gap. Fear of divorce deserves its own moment here because I think it's easy to mistake for something deeper than it is. A person can be terrified of losing their marriage, their family structure, their social standing, their financial stability, all at once, and every bit of that fear can be completely real. But fear of losing something is not the same emotional event as grief over having hurt someone. This connects directly back to that idea of prudential regret we touched on earlier. Someone can be genuinely desperate to save the marriage while still being almost entirely focused on their own loss, rather than on what their partner actually experienced. Sorry the marriage might end, and sorry for what I did to you can look nearly identical from across the kitchen table, and they are not the same sentence. Empathy is really the hinge that everything else swings on. Researchers keep finding the same basic pattern here. State empathy, meaning empathy actually felt in the moment rather than claimed afterward, predicts more complete, less defensive apologies. Guilt correlates with empathy fairly reliably. Shame, interestingly, can actually block it because shame tends to pull attention inward toward protecting a threatened self image rather than outward toward understanding what the other person is going through. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it means someone can look deeply ashamed, in obvious visible distress, while that very shame is actively working against the empathy that would make genuine repair possible. Accountability is where all of this either gets tested or gets revealed as hollow. Researchers draw a meaningful line between confession that happens voluntarily before someone's cornered by evidence and confession that only comes out once there's no other option left. Voluntary disclosure predicts significantly more forgiveness and more perceived integrity than an admission dragged out through confrontation. There's a specific finding that captures this well: that spontaneous confession, offered with a kind of willing surrender to the consequences, produces more empathy and more forgiveness than an admission that only happens because someone got caught with the evidence already in hand. Real accountability also tends to be an active, ongoing process rather than a single moment. Researchers describe couples working through recovery as needing to jointly examine the extent of what happened and the reasons behind it, not just receive one clean, contained confession and then move on. Which brings us to consistent behavioral change, the piece that ties everything else together. Researchers are fairly direct about this one. Apology on its own, without follow through, gets described in the literature using a phrase I think is worth repeating: cheap talk. Comprehensive apologies that actually predict lasting repair tend to include a forward looking commitment, not just acknowledgement of the past. And when actual restitution or concrete repair is offered, something tangible, changed access, changed transparency, changed behavior, it outperforms verbal apology alone at reducing anger and rebuilding trust. Words are cheap to produce. Sustained, consistent behavior is not, and that difference in cost is exactly what makes behavior the more trustworthy signal. I want to end with something honest, because I think it matters more than anything else in this episode, and it's easy to get this wrong. It would be comforting to believe that if the remorse is genuine, healing on the other side follows naturally and proportionally. The research does not actually support that clean a relationship. One study using EMDR therapy with couples recovering from attachment trauma found meaningful reductions in intrusive thoughts, avoidance, and hyperarousal, the exact trauma symptoms we've discussed across this whole series. And those reductions held up regardless of the offending partner's remorse, regardless of gender, regardless of whether the betrayal was a single incident or something longer running. What predicted symptom reduction was structured therapeutic processing, not the emotional state of the person who caused the harm. I think that's worth sitting with plainly. A partner's genuine remorse might matter enormously for the future of the relationship itself, but the betrayed partner's own trauma recovery appears to run largely on its own track, one that depends on their own processing and support, not on waiting for someone else to finally feel the right thing in the right way. So here's where that leaves the question we opened with: are they sorry, or are they just sorry they got caught? The clearest signal isn't a single apology, however well worded, and it isn't a dramatic display in the moment either. It's the pattern across defensiveness, patience with hard questions, willingness to name what actually happened instead of managing how it looks, empathy that reaches toward the other person's experience instead of just their own, accountability offered before it's forced, and behavior that keeps holding steady long after the initial crisis has passed. And whichever answer that pattern points toward, it's worth remembering that the healing on your side of the table was never fully contingent on it in the first place. Before I close, here's the shape of it. Guilt looks outward toward the harm caused, regret looks inward toward one's own damaged self image, and remorse sits much closer to guilt than to regret, which is why guilt and remorse reliably drive repair, while regret alone often doesn't. Watch for defensiveness, impatience with the same question coming back around, and performances of contrition that look convincing but change nothing underneath. Fear of losing the marriage is not the same thing as grief over what was done. Empathy is the variable everything else depends on, and real accountability shows up before it's forced out by evidence. Words alone are cheap. Consistent behavior over time is the expensive and therefore trustworthy signal. And regardless of which one you're looking at, your own recovery from this runs on its own track, not on someone else finally feeling the right thing. That's where I want to leave this one. I'm Esther Adams, and this has been Strides to Solutions.